Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Achilles. It's really Achilles' great passion that has carried this event forward over more than a decade now. His commitment to it is something quite extraordinary, and he has really created and sustained this event. So thank you, Achilles, again, for all you've done. So Achilles wants a provocation. What is a provocation? I suppose it's an invitation to tilt the lens, to look at the world from a different standpoint, to question assumptions, even language itself. This forum, properly conceived, should then be a provocation. It is so easy these days to stay in your lane, be comforted by people who already think like you or scream like you. Nobody likes to say, I got it wrong. I find the words of Adama Sane yesterday here echoing in my head, how the minds of intelligent people shut down when it comes to Africa, how prejudice and stereotypes prevail, how the continent is always somebody else's object, how incredible the arrogance is of believing you are the center of the world, how even a phrase like geopolitical hub may contain its measure of contempt and insult. Africa is not a hub. Africa is not an object. Africa is not a country. In many ways, it is our future. It is Namatai Kwekeweza in her passionate lucidity at the age of 24. My great-grandparents fled Russian pogroms in Lithuania for South Africa at the end of the 19th century. My parents were born in Johannesburg. My father, who could not abide apartheid, the waste, he would mutter, decided we had to pack our bags and get out. My mother never recovered. She was a transplant that would not take under the dirty bathwater skies of Britain. We all have our stories. I am a South African Jew who became British and then 2 decades ago became an American. To the extent my family benefited from the crime of apartheid, I would like to apologize. We need recognition and contrition to begin to move forward. I am the other, or I am because of you. That is how Nelson Mandela described the meaning of Ubuntu, a word mentioned by Adama, who also alluded to teranga, the deep sense of welcoming in Senegal, a welcoming made possible by a culture where there is no other. 2 words, 2 ways of turning other into brother or sister, of course. War is the demonization of the other. It is the end point of failure. It is the violence that lurks in our natures made manifest. In her poem Hatred, Wisława Szymborska, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish poet, writes of how easily it vaults the tallest obstacles, how rapidly it pounces, tracks us down. Hatred, its face twisted in a grimace of erotic ecstasy. How listless, how wan are other feelings. Since when does brotherhood draw crowds, she writes? Has compassion ever finished first? She was right. The eros of hatred is potent. It replaces pointlessness with purpose. It is always available to the nationalist demagogue, ready to identify scapegoats, promise vengeance, and whip a pliant populace into a baying frenzy. It propagates what the great poet Paul Celan called the 1,000 darknesses of murderous speech. Democracies have suffered since the Cold War ended from self-satisfied blindness to their eternal fragility and from acceptance of forms of injustice that are unacceptable. Last year, Vladimir Putin brought war to a European continent that thought itself beyond war. Perhaps 250,000 Russians and Ukrainians have lost their lives for little or nothing. The front line has stopped moving. The dying continues. There is no end in sight. I was in Russia for a month this year. At the time, I think the only US correspondent in a vast country that has turned radically against the West. I was in Siberia, and in a cemetery, I watched as an old couple used a shovel to dig a grave. "Who are you burying?" I asked. "Our grandson." "How old was he?" 19. "What happened?" "Ukraine happened," she said. Ukraine happened. Yes, Ukraine happened. It happened even to this Russian family several thousand miles from the front. It happened in Mykolaiv in southern Ukraine on the Black Sea, where I spent a month last year and heard Anna Svetlaya, her face a mosaic of cuts and bruises and blood after a random Russian rocket attack, yet another random Russian rocket attack on her apartment. I heard her say, "The Russians just don't like us. We wish we knew why." So many Russians and Ukrainians have family ties. It takes mutilation to obliterate that resemblance. The war has been many things, one of them a wake-up call to the West. Much of the world does not see the conflict through the lens of Washington or Berlin. The pendulum has swung. A world of multi-alignment is upon us, a world in flux. "We do not define ourselves one way or another," said Caroline Gaita of Kenya. "We look east, at what cost? We look west, at what cost?" Over the past couple of days, we've heard in different ways how the world's democracies must take in and adjust to this shift to be effective in the world. There should be no assumptions of authority, we've heard at times, stemming from the pronouncement of words like democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, a free press, for what crimes have been committed in their name. Yet these words remain sacred. For how many millions have they liberated? How painfully and through what sacrifice have they been enshrined? How tenuous is their hold? And what nightmarish gulag awaits a world without them? Ukraine's fight is indeed a broader one for the freedom of humanity and for the dignity without which life is no more than solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes put it. The war is not the epicenter of the world, but it is of critical importance that it not be lost, indeed that it be won, however victory is ultimately defined. Democracy, we are told, has lost its magnetism. But have you noticed all the people desperate to get into China, desperate to get into Russia, desperate to get into Turkey of late? They say they want to live in a civilizational state. Old Enlightenment ideas like personal liberty don't matter to them. They clamor, millions and millions of these 21st century migrants, to live civilizationally. On the Chinese, Russian, and Turkish borders, a state of full military alert can scarcely contain the flow. They say they yearn for the meritocracy of the Middle Kingdom, or for the Tsar's absolute and quasi-religious authority, or for an Islamic civilizational identity. Banners are held aloft. We want to be unfree, or surveillance, not liberty. Great swathes of humanity turn away from the West, a scheme for global takeover masquerading as a template for individual happiness, to embrace the joys of autocracy. Funny, ladies and gentlemen, I have not seen those crowds. I have not seen those people clamoring to get into those countries. When people cannot vote with a ballot, they vote with their feet. which is why they seek to build their lives in the United States or the European Union or Brazil or Australia, for example. This I have observed in a life of movement. The human urge to be free is universal and unquenchable. Journalists try to look on both sides, which is why I went to Ukraine and Russia over the past year. If you don't go, you don't know. There is no substitute for boots on the ground, for looking someone in the eye, for seeing, touching, feeling, absorbing. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. To write is violent combat in search of the irrefutable cadence. There is more to be abjured than added, more truth in distillation than accumulation. To write is loneliness. It is excavation. It is struggle. Patience. Look around the next corner. The subject will reveal itself to you if you restrain the impulse to impose it. The story must build from the inside out, like the butterfly from the chrysalis, with a slow unfolding of wings. Writing begins where the anecdotal stops. Working from a core of pain and melancholy, it's not surprising that I sought out those same emotions in refugee camps, in war zones, at remote borders, in the shanties and the shebeens, at the face of a South African gold reef 1 mile down, in Chengdu, where a Chinese woman crushed by the state had self-immolated, among the displaced and the exploited and the terrified. That was my place, that my debt. Objectivity is a fine word, a fine journalistic aspiration even, but it's a dead word, freighted with too many syllables, and we are human. We bring to what we write our own unique sensibilities and struggles, our hypocrisies too, and if we fail to do so, we become uninteresting. Halftones interest me more than primary colors. Van Gogh's flowers are always wilting slightly, lilies that turn from pink to purple and a little brownish on the edges. The artist is interested in the beauty of the equipoise between life and death. And isn't that where we're all situated without paying much attention to it? Ours is a culture of perfection, of all or nothing, of primary colors and primal screams, of unforgiving trial by the mob, proud in its refusal to compromise. And so we have many problems, and so our democracies can look broken. As Leonard Cohen observed, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Let us listen, let us see the other, let us acknowledge our own imperfection, let us reach out a hand to the stranger, let us preserve the value of the word truth. We are lucky to be here, enfolded in Greek civilization. I never forget that every time I come here. It's the deviation from strict symmetry that imbues the Parthenon with its pulse of life. The folds and pleats of Athenian statuary are supple. That is why they are alive. The human pulse is not a metronome. We are not storage devices. We inhabit the intermediate zones. Isaiah Berlin wrote in The Crooked Timber of Humanity, "No perfect solution is, not merely in practice but in principle, possible in human affairs, and any determined attempt to produce it is likely to lead to suffering, disillusionment, and failure." Democracy is imperfect, ladies and gentlemen, and in that imperfection lies its distinctive humanity, its beauty, its elasticity, the quality that every quest for utopia ends up crushing. It was not created for robots that understand the pattern of words, but have no idea about the meaning of those words. Our last best chance, I believe, lies in safeguarding democracy. But we must acknowledge that it fails at the point where the idea that I am the other, Ubuntu, disappears entirely from the discourse, buried under a mountain of hedge funds and selfies. It's worth fighting to make sure that does not happen. Hope has been the message of this forum. We've moved over the last 3 days from overcast skies to the blue skies of today and the sunshine. Let that be a metaphor and a message. Thank you very much.